Mhm.
All right, folks, welcome back. It's been a little bit of a break because we had our last study where Isaac nearly got sacrificed, and then I had a meeting, and then I was out of town, and now we're finally back. So, in the 2 weeks that we've kind of been off, have there been any thoughts, lingering questions, lingering opinions about the near sacrifice of the long-awaited child? Any thoughts or comments or?
Well, of course, I always have something. I read it over, and then I read the next chapter, and the chapter after that. So what I was kind of curious about, we talked about that it was something that happened at the time in other areas of in the area, and it was a test, and some of the background on that. But I was kind of curious that how did later Jews, when they were doing commentaries, how did they deal with that? I mean, we know what we say about it, but what do Christians say about it? But it's
I will say I'm not an expert in Jewish interpretation.
I was just if you had some knowledge of that, because
not off the top of my head of how it's
talked
about, but it's one of those. I know that in our discussion, just all around, we've been a little bit more on the skeptical, critical side of Abraham and his actions, or maybe inquisitive would be a better way to say it. That said, the Jewish tradition all the way around doesn't have as rigid of a sense of what I would call sin. The idea of sin and the separation between God and humanity and original sin with Adam and Eve, those are all really Christian concepts, where the Jewish tradition has a lot more of just questions, and you answer questions with 3 questions, and you answer those 3 questions with more questions. And so there is not as rigid a sense of
it's okay to question.
It's okay to question, and it's okay for things to be morally a little bit ambiguous, where we kind of want what's right, and we want things separated, or that's been at least the Christian trajectory, is a lot of those a really solid sense of this is right and this is wrong, where we're going to get some morally ambiguous characters coming up, and it's kind of thought about more in the context of what do you have to do to survive? What do you do when you do have to do questionable things to get to save you and your people, basically. So it's one thing I would always keep in mind, and this is both in this, but I think in general, when you're talking to other people, when you're seeing other family systems, when you're looking at people of different cultures, one thing that's always at play is, where is there flexibility in the system and where is there rigidity? Because most everyone needs some of both. If you think of how plants build plant material, some plants are very rigid in their leaves, and if you press their leaves, the leaves will snap, but there's flexibility in other spots, where a tree has a very rigid trunk but very flexible branches and leaves. And so always where is there rigidity, where is there more formality and rigidity and flexibility? So in our tradition, we have more of a very rigid sense of sin and confession and freedom, and that structure is really strong. And you have freedom around it because we have freedom from sin, where this is more of a system where the rigidity is found in, you follow these guidelines for how to live a good life, but the system of good and bad, of sin and righteousness, that's where they find their flexibility. Kind of if you do the practices, you will figure out the other side, the other part, and there's moral ambiguity in both ways of looking at the world. It's just like, where do you want your structure, basically?
Oh, that's interesting. I read our other book, How to Read the Bible, to see if there was anything in there. But so I got on into the chapter on the two different concepts of God in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew Bible. And at this point, God is really more like a man hanging out, and he doesn't know what you think. And he doesn't, he's not all knowing and omniscient. And they're angels, and but the angels don't have wings like the angels in the paintings. They look more like men, but there's often fog around them. And you know, it was kind of interesting because it was but later on in the apparently, I don't know how much later on, God becomes more all-knowing, but certainly not at this point. So that would, it seems almost like they're figuring it out together, but God has the last word. Is that?
So one perspective I take on I kind of came to in my own studies, when thinking about, because yeah, the way people talk about God in the Bible changes dramatically. And I look at it is in some ways of people's like the Bible being people's experience of God. And that I could like hold together a little bit more, because there's a lot of things in here that people, like, it's written down that like God says to do this, and I find it deeply troubling. The book of Judges is really hard to read when like God is saying, go kill this entire people group, and like wrestling with what that means and how we're supposed to understand it. What I personally came to is this is what people thought God was saying. This is people's recorded history of how they interacted with God. And so it kind of makes sense if some people feel like they're interacting with a God that's more like a man standing there, and then some other people later on were interacting God with more of this bodiless entity, and God knows my thoughts. That's a different experience, and so we can hold together people's different experiences.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts before we jump in for today's passage is fairly short, so I was going to take some time to chat it up. All right. Well, hearing none, let's talk. Let's actually get into chapter 23, one of the shorter chapters in Genesis. So, and it kind of works as a transition, and this is one of the major transitions. We've seen a few of them before where you get like, think about when we change from a lot of the early stories that were kind of more in the realm of mythology, of like world building is what I would call it. The literal creation and world building, but also like setting up like, these are the rules that the earth is going to abide by. God's not going to flood us. We have a bunch of languages now, all those kind of like starter stories. This is now going to work like our transitional, because we're transitioning out of Abraham and Abraham's story. This is kind of the end. Like, Abraham isn't dying, but this is ushering us into the next generation. And the tone of the story starts to change as we transition from Abraham to Abraham's kids and grandkids. So we jump in with the very formula kind of, as we've been talking about, like the priestly, we're going to deal with the numbers. So Sarah lived 127 years, and that's the length of Sarah's life. And stated that way. And so the next thing that they have to deal with is we have the matriarch of the family, and she lived long enough to have a baby and evidently raise him, because I believe she was closer to 100. So if you're trusting these biblical numbers, she's been raising Isaac for like 20-ish years now, and she passes away. And then we have this situation of Abraham dealing with the fact that he needs to bury his wife. He's not going to carry her around with her. His practice is still like he needs a place to put her. And so we once again have this kind of situation where he's having to interact with the locals and interact with the people around him. We're now in a new location, though. We're no longer in, is it Nabor? No, Nahor? It's the one down south. It's, the Negev desert. That's where we are dealing. So we're slightly north of the Negev. We have moved from the Philistine people who were a little bit on the south and more on the coast to the Hittite Empire, which is more based up top. And so we've moved people groups, and now Abraham has to strike a new deal with a new people group. But this time it's not just like, I have to do a business relationship with you. Now it's, I need a place to put someone beloved to me. So what are your all's initial take of this kind of, I mean, it is a business interaction, but we do get a little bit of emotion from Abraham and how he's dealing with the whole situation. What do you all think?
Me.
Yeah, Marielle.
It seems to me that there's some kind of a political discussion going on here, that Abraham is determined to pay for the land where they are giving him permission to bury Sarah, and they are wanting him to do it with no compensation. And so to me, that just has political overtones all over it. So it's my reaction.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out what had actually happened because they kept insisting that they were going to give Abraham the land. And the next thing you know, he's counting out the shekels. It doesn't make sense.
And what about that amount of money in those days? Was that a lot of money, or just a modest amount for a piece of land with a cave on it to bury the dead? Oh.
Well, the seller doesn't think it's very much.
Well, the seller set the price.
He's minimizing the amount. Do you think 400 shekels would come between us or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at the notes here because I noticed that too, and I forgot to look it up beforehand. This is at least what my study Bible is saying. Ephron the Hittite and Abraham engage in an elaborate deferential dialogue that results in the sale of a cave and a field for an exorbitant price that Abraham is still willing to pay.
Okay, so it's a high price.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit of we can talk about the effects of this, but yes, like it's funny, like it seems like every time Abraham walks up to a group of people, all of a sudden we're like, this situation's political. Like Abraham has a sense about him that he's always going in and something's gonna happen here. And so what's funny, I can't remember the television show, but I remember the scene. I think it was one of those times where you were like on vacation and you're tired, and so you just turn the TV on and you get like half of an episode with no context of a TV show you've never watched. And what I remember is it was the main character going into a friend's house who was of like Middle Eastern descent of some kind. And there is an exchange of like, oh my gosh, the rug in your room is beautiful. And the parents immediately respond with, oh, do you want it? We'll roll it up for you. And the person's like, no, you don't have to give me the rug. And they're like, oh, no, we would love to give you the rug. It would be lovely. And it's like, no, I absolutely cannot take the rug from your house. And then they were like, okay, well, if you want it, just let us know. And there was that like interesting interaction. And there was an aside, and part of the joke was, if someone insists on giving you something 3 times, they intend to give it to you. If they only insist on giving it to you twice, that's polite. And so, but the thing is, you're supposed to also refuse a certain amount of times. It's almost like a battle of wills in like hospitality and generosity. And so there's a certain amount that like, I don't know if you've ever had the interaction before where you have complimented something from someone and they literally just like take it off and put it on you, and you feel kind of weird because it's like, I actually didn't mean to like take this thing from you, but like, I don't know how to give it back to you now. But there's this whole interplay that I know is actually still present in certain cultures where, yes, if you compliment something, they will offer it to you, but you're not actually supposed to accept it. Unless they like really, really, really insist. And so that's partly what I see going on here. There is politeness, there is generosity, but there's also evidently a little bit of extortion in the price. Okay. So we have Abraham going to this people group he's now in, and he's like, let me buy land. Let me buy land to bury my wife, which, you know, that is an honorable request. I think everyone can kind of relate. There is a decision Abraham is not making. Abraham's not taking her back home. He's moved a lot in life, but he's not making the trip back to Ur and burying her with her family. That trip was possible. They've traveled enough all over the place. He could make the effort to take her back. And that is important for what we're going to see at the end of the story. Okay. So just like put that one in the memory bank for literally like one of the last chapters of Genesis. Okay. Sarah's not being taken home. Abraham is choosing to bury her in the land where they are. What significance does it have to want to be buried where you are versus where you're from?
Well, you think of all the men that were killed during the wars, and the big quest to you know, return the remains. You know, they're still doing that for men that were killed in World War II. Bringing the remains back from the foreign land and burying them at Arlington or in the family graveyard. You know, so yeah, there's still that desire.
Yeah.
What is Flanders Field? American soldiers or French? Because there are a lot of.
Well, there's still a lot of U.S. service people buried overseas, but buried in the so-called American cemetery.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, the note said that if you bury somebody in the new land, you're always claiming ownership, or it's your piece of land if you have burying your people there. Is that what you're getting at?
I mean, this is open-ended because I still think this is something that applies to today, because we're a very transient society, especially today. And I think it's something interesting to think about. And Mary Ellen, you seem like you have a thought.
Yes, and it could be fleeting. I'm wondering if leaving the most important part of his life in a foreign land isn't setting up the future relationships between the two peoples, that you know, he will want the right I mean, I'm projecting our ethics on it, but he would want the right to come back and, perhaps visit or want to protect that land should conflict come along. I'm wondering if my bottom line is this going to play out in the future, that there's a reason to leave her there?
So, I mean, this plays out today, actually. This is actually, so my first trip to Israel, Palestine, the second one was with a church group, but the first one was in seminary specifically to study the conflict. And one of the most heartbreaking cities that we went to was Hebron, which is the site of some of the most brutal violence between the modern day Israelis and the modern day Palestinians, because Hebron's in the West Bank. So technically should be under Palestinian control. At least what we have signed, or what they have signed, says that Israel should leave it alone, but it's where Sarah's buried.
Oh,
And the Israeli government has built literally a corridor to allow Israeli citizens to enter Hebron. It's gotten to the point where the Palestinians own the market space. Most Palestinians have their houses and their businesses on the ground floor, but the Israelis hold the second 2 stories. And there's literally conflict above and below. And both people groups are terrible to each other. That is the one thing I will say. But they literally had to build a cage over the market space because people were throwing bricks and human refuse and occasionally acid from the windows on the people on the ground floor. And then the people on the ground floor were visiting other forms of violence on the people above them. And it's all because Sarah's buried there. And so the Jewish people don't want to give up this, what they see now as their ancestral city. Because that's what happens when you bury people in the ground. People talk about their ancestors and where they're from. So I think about it both in like how we track what like people group we're from. We often think about where, like my family is, Hallam is an English name. It comes from Hallamshire, England. And it's like, I have that connection, partly not just because they lived there. Like I've lived in Michigan, but none of my family's buried here. And that feels interesting. And now we have a city that even today, both people groups have people buried there and they don't know how to work it out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think having people like part of your history buried in the earth, it does something. And maybe it's just our human psychology, but it seems like we interact with places differently. Like, are you all people who like visit either like people visit famous battlegrounds for that reason, because there's the history that's literally the earth shows, or visiting cemeteries. Like, are you all cemetery visitors, battlefield visitors? Like, what do you do? Is there a culture of visiting people who have already passed away?
my mother visited her father's grave, I think. It was a Memorial Day thing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people do it as much. People have ashes and they're sprinkling them all over the place. So,
The tradition of cemetery visitation, though, at least, for example, in my family, seems to be gradually dying out.
yeah.
There was generally one segment of the family or one person that always saw that the graves were taken care of. Well, then
Yes.
they pass away and nobody picks up the torch, and it dwindles.
Yeah.
Mary Ellen?
You're really making me think, because all of my family is in Whitechapel, and my parents are there, my sister, both brothers-in-law, And yet every time I drive by, there's a memory, there's a pause, there's, something happening to me as I particularly drive up Crooks, because that's such a long side of open view of where the burial plots are. But now if I were to drive in, I only have a vague clue where that would be. But as I'm talking, I'm remembering my grandparents are actually in the mausoleum. And so, that's very easy to find. You just get the map of what floor and whatever. But I hadn't really thought of it, how much of my life is right here. No, I just made me think.
So the other thing that I know for my mother was really important. So her family has lived in Columbia, Missouri. Some parts of her family predate the Civil War in that city. And the thing is, there are very few plots in her family area left. And so it was really important to her that she had a space in the family plot. But because her and my dad now have slots, there's no room for me. Which is fine. That's not something that's overly important to me because I didn't really grow up in that city. I don't have as much connection to it. But the other thought that it brings up is, what does it mean to be the first person in your family to be buried in a new spot? Whether that is you're from somewhere and going to a new area and you're going to be from there. Or even thinking about people who have crossed oceans and there's no really going back and they have to make a new cemetery and all of a sudden there has to be a first, because that's what Sarah is. But Mary Ellen, your hand went up quick there.
But yeah, you're really triggering stuff for me here, because I will be the first. The plot has 6 lots, or the lot has 6, I don't know how it goes, but they were in sections of 6. And so my mother and father and both sisters and brother-in-laws are the 6. And so I'm the one that's left out. And my sisters conned me into it when I was 24 years old. You'll marry, you'll go with your husband's plot. Anyway, signed off on it. But that's why I've always considered, the columbarium at Northminster, as that would be my preference. Still in the area, but still with my community, kind of a thing.
Yeah. So even that is is lovely and interesting when you think about not just like being buried with a family, but being buried with the community that meant something to you. Because yeah, a lot of people are like, I love that, like I have a straight eye view into the memorial garden. And it was actually one of my, not this past Easter. It was the second Easter we did online. And it was a bit of a goofy sermon. And I know because that was the one where I'm like, Jesus is missing. And I like filmed going over there and that whole thing. But the end of it was actually like something I really loved being able to do, because Easter morning, or well, it wasn't Easter morning, but the me talking in the garden, like I got to spend it thinking about what it meant for like the members of our community to be there. Some of it, not all of them, but like people who chose that this is where they wanted to be from in a way. And seeing some of the tree that's planted in the center, which was one of the first memorial or internments that I did here, and seeing the kids come back and having that space and to have it be green and growing, but like this idea of like to be from somewhere or to be somewhere. And it's not always about you. Sometimes it's about the people who come after you and allowing them to be from somewhere.
Do you have to make any special arrangements through session or anything to formalize that?
No. So there's a document that you can I have on file, but basically all we need, or there's a price so we can put a plaque on the wall. Otherwise, I just sign off that I got the ashes and that they're in the ground. But no, it's not. It's actually very. It's informal in a way that I think gives a lot of freedom, because it's not. Because we're not doing bodies, but it's ashes only. It makes the legality part is very easy, and yeah, it's open for anyone. It's open for even non-members if they wanted.
That's good.
It's sort of interesting. You can go to the funeral home and pick up the bag of ashes, but you can't go and pick up the body.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I know we're thinking a lot of like both like our experiences and things, but let's bring it back in here. So I think some of our inclination in the things that we're talking about is exactly what Abraham's thinking and talking about is. So the call that he had was leave where your father was from. And in a way, I feel like this is one of the seals that like he's done it. He's no longer from Ur. He doesn't just want to be a guest. I think there is something actually, like, it's not just political here, even if he is playing the politeness game. It changes something, doesn't it, when it's not just like you're burying your wife as a guest in the land, but he is willing to pay a very large amount of money to say like, no, this is the family burial ground.
Mhm.
What do you all think of that? He goes definitely out of his way, and let's see, what verse is this? Verse 13. Like, I heard that verse not just as like, if you would just hear me, like not just political, like sweet talking that I sometimes hear when I read Abraham's, but it sounded almost pleading to me, like, if you would only listen to me, let me pay for it. Like, come on, let me do this one final act. I don't want my wife to be in a place as a stranger. I want her to have a home.
Yeah, that's true.
So if he pays for it, it's a home. It's if he doesn't, she's just visiting. Is that it?
Oh, or she's a guest. Will be a perpetual
guest.
stranger. Yeah.
Okay, was important that he. So do you think that I've forgotten about who he was negotiating with, but Ephron, that the negotiating had to do with getting as much money as he could for it?
So there is possibly. So there's a few things that may be happening. I cannot guarantee. Like I said, I'm not an ancient culture scholar. There's a certain point where having the debate in public is something where it gets people's attention and eyes on the situation. Because if you don't, there's no way to write a receipt. They're not exactly literate in the way that we would understand it. It's not to say that they didn't have ways to do this or they were completely unlettered, but it's so we see this back and forth, and that it kind of draws the community around. And you notice by the end, it is Abraham weighs out and pays the 40 shekels in front of the people. And so, especially with something that is that big of a price, it's done very publicly to make sure both sides are being honest and make sure neither side's being coerced. That may also be the reason for the back and forth, is to kind of like show that it's like Abraham's not just agreeing or is paying just because Ephron's like, hey, yeah, pay, or like, oh, you don't have to do that. Abraham's like, oh, no, I'll pay you. And Ephron's just like, okay, exorbitant price. But because there's a little bit of a back and forth, you can see that Abraham is insisting, therefore, that he is insisting or agreeing to what is a high price. And so it's like kind of a way to ensure that, like, I'm going in understanding the terms and conditions. So that may be a little bit at play. The other thing, though, is while caves are common, they're also not common, and preparing a piece of land for burial does take work. You have to chisel out holes in the rock, or like finding a natural cave is really valuable. So this there's also that element that it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to sell you something that I plan to use for my family, that means I then have to go prepare a different piece of land. Either I have to buy, or like I have to set aside another piece of rock and actually carve a hole in this one, or I have to go like investigate what kind of cave systems are around. We have to do a little bit of exploration. It's so Abraham might also be paying for a little bit of services, because it's, if this guy knows that there's a rock with a hole in it, he's done some work to know that it's there, and he probably intended to use it himself. So there is some negotiation happening. So does that kind of give a little bit of clarity of the back and forth of it all? And any other questions that it seems like this seems weird? Why is this happening? All right, so this is kind of in some way, or like I said, this is kind of wrapping up the Abraham side. We have the three promises that God, if you remember all the different things God covenanted many times before, we see them all present here. He has an heir. He finally has the heir, the long-awaited process, or a promise. Granted, it's all, well, he banished one son, and then the other son, he only has one. So it, like, that promise is still hanging on by a thread. It's not the father of many yet, but there is hope, because we do have Isaac. If you notice the way that Ephraim speaks to him, he's like, mighty prince among us. He is very clearly wealthy and very clearly blessed, and he's blessed to be a blessing. And so we kind of see people regard him this way. That part of the covenant is there. And then the last one, while we speculated before about the well and having water rights, and does that actually mean ownership, and what's going on in that negotiation, here we have undeniable proof that Abraham has a piece of land and his family can come back to it. Here is the place where everyone is going to always know that Abraham is from, or have that piece of it. So we have finally all three pieces of the covenant are present undeniably here.
Wow.
Okay.
And so the Abraham cycle is kind of complete.
This is the first land that he has, like his name on the first property. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So all this elaborate negotiations and so forth, the purpose of having that recorded in the Bible is to establish that particular, well, maybe that particular location, but at least to establish that particular fact that now Abraham really has the promised land, or at least a part of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha.
So this is where always investigate when you hear the way, I mean, the politics of the area that is Israel and Palestine is complicated. Like I spent an entire 4 months studying it and another month over there seeing and talking to people. And all I can say is I still know a drop in the bucket. But there's a lot of loaded language even today that gets put around the situation about like who's been there longer. And we see here just very clearly that like, yes, there's ancestral rights. Yes, there is ownership. Yes, there's a claim. But there's also a claim for the people around. So it's never, even in the beginning, it wasn't cut and dry. So my word of my plead to you all is anytime people think that the situation is easy or cut and dry, trust me, it is not, and it never was. And this, we see just even the messiness of humanity here. And it's been like at least 4,000 years since this story happened. And we see the just like the echoes and the reverberations and the messiness of humanity just play out through the 4,000 years between now and then. That's a rough give or take. But how much even one person having their name on a piece of land can make those waves in history is just fascinating.
Sure causes a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. Well, any other thoughts? Because I didn't prep Isaac and Rebecca, and that's a fun story that I want to talk about together. And if not, I was actually going to give you all I looked up a few of the little people groups that keep popping up and giving a little bit of background. So are you all interested in that, or did you just want to wrap it up for the, okay, cool.
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
So there's just a few definitions of terms that I've kind of given a little bit of a verbal hint at. This hopefully in the next 10 minutes we'll get a little bit more of a bearing, because these people groups are going to keep coming up now. So I have a few maps. These are based on the HarperCollins Study Bible maps, but I blew them up because I use them as teaching tools. And so I traced and hand painted these. But the first one that is good to have in mind, and this is a map of the time we're actually talking about. And so this, let me see, there we go. The black areas that you see around here, so just to orient you, this is modern day Turkey. You see the Sinai Peninsula, and this is, the yellow is the Empire of Egypt. All the black area is basically just tribal land where there's no one power, but it's kind of just locally controlled. What we're talking about with the Hittites, this is the Hittite Empire, where it starts in modern day Turkey. They are seen as kind of the proto ancestors of the Turkish people today. And so they start off as like a loose band and a loose confederation. They kind of have a little empire. They don't have a really big one, but their influence will come down. So this little blue line here, if you see that, that is the River Jordan and the Dead Sea. So that kind of orients you. Modern day Israel kind of goes from there to there. So you see the power and influence. Egypt has a lot of this area is just, Egypt will always have a lot of cultural influence, but not direct control. But they go head to head with the Hittite Empire and kind of loosely try to have, if not direct control, trade control. These are two other empires, I forget which one, but they're like little baby empires. The one to pay attention to is this one over here. This is both where Abraham is from, roughly the land of Ur, but that is the baby Babylonian Empire. So the thing, when you see here the Fertile Crescent, you notice how the empires are in this little loop here. That's the Fertile Crescent. So we already see that where there is water, where you can grow things, that is where these little empires are starting up. So this is roughly like Bronze and Iron Age, where they're when I looked up the Hittites to kind of like learn a little bit just before I turned this on, they were classically thought to be the ones who invented iron smelting. but it looks like they actually may have been making their weapons out of meteorites, which is fascinating. How did they learn to do that? No clue. But they were kind of initially an empire, once again, baby empire, if only because they knew how to metalwork a little bit sooner than some of the places around them. What very quickly happens, and this is where like a lot of what we've talked about in the summer sermon series, and like when we talk about Babylon and Babylon attacking, it's because that little baby empire of this becomes that. So this whole blue area is Babylon, and they push back Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula. But the thing is, up here, this is the Persian Empire. So they take what was the Hittite Empire, they push a little bit further into Turkey. Here is more like Iran, Iraq area. But we see that they're already having conflicts. And so Babylon just like annihilates the area and takes over everything. And so they haul everyone back to exile over here. And then Cyrus the Great comes in, and after Babylon, you can see how much Persia just takes over. And so this is what it looks like before Alexander the Great. And you can see once again the kind of the crescent shape, and just all of it is where Persia just like comes through. They even take over most of Egypt, and kind of they're the ones that kind of break Egypt the first time, because Egypt had a very stable reign, if only because the weather was predictable, the Nile was predictable, the growing seasons were predictable. Everything was so stable in Egypt, partly because the weather was just stable, and it wasn't in other places.
So the Persian Empire, what era are we talking year-wise?
So the Persians, I am bad at this. So I don't have my, I should put dates on the maps. I never like wrote out things because I don't like my
Okay, that's
handwriting.
all
I
right.
just like the
That's all
pictures.
right. I just-
When you the rebuilding of the temple, when they actually like build the temple again, the reconstruction, when you hear the verses that we read a lot of Persian aged Bible verses from Isaiah during Christmas. A lot of Christmas verses are from the Persian era, when they're like, make a straight, or not Christmas, sorry, that's the wrong one. Let me straighten it out. The beginning of Lent, when it says make a straight way in the wilderness, God is like making a new way on the highways of God. All of that of like make straight the path, raise up the valleys, lower the mountains. God is doing something new, making a way in the wilderness. That all sounds familiar, right?
Mhm.
That's when Persia is sending the people home. That's when the Persian, so the last third of Isaiah is basically in the Persian
Okay,
era.
okay.
But then Alexander the Great plows through the entire area. And
Mhm.
after Alexander the Great, we have the Roman Empire, and and they just kind of take over the same area, except that is also under Roman control. And so Rome just controlled the entire area, which is why we don't always need a map. But the last thing, where's my first map? The thing that this doesn't exactly show is this kind of, do you see where there's like that orange stripe there? That's where the Philistines kind of hung out. So the Philistines are a mysterious group. They're fascinating. They are credited for the ones who created purple dye. So anything that was colored purple was through the Philistines. So if you think of like a lot of Roman generals, and you know how they have those purple capes, that meant they were trading with the Philistines or the Philistine people. I looked it up just before, like once again in my like pre-research, because I thought it would be helpful to know these groups. The Philistines are seen as the seafaring people. That's what their name actually translates to. They are newcomers to the shores of like the whole Canaanite area. And they think they came from Greece. and kind of just like seafared over. And so they're a very mercantile group of people, which is why they have a lot of cities, and they're very much on the coast. The purple dye comes from this one like snail, and they found if they crushed up the shell, they get that really royal purple color. And so when they establish all their cities on the coast, they have all the access to all the purple shells, which is why they basically have a monopoly on the color purple, which does come up in the Bible. If you know Lydia is, I think, in Acts, but she's a purple fabric dealer. She's wealthy because she's a purple fabric dealer. So while we tend to use the term Philistine to mean kind of an uncultured person, the Philistines were actually anything but. They were very sophisticated, like almost like New Yorkers establishing like little mini New Yorks on the rest of the world and trading ports. That's actually more like what they were. They were very metropolitan. That's the word I'm looking for. They were very metropolitan.
And where did you say they think they came from initially?
Somewhere in like the islands around Greece, because Greece
Islands
wasn't like a
around Greece.
unified state.
Okay.
There was probably just a people group who decided to make establish a new place somewhere else. So the Philistines are also newcomers to the area. They just had a lot of already developed culture that they brought with them. The thing for understanding David and Goliath is the Philistines had far better weaponry. They, like, the swords and everything were much sturdier. The army of Israel had very rudimentary weapons, which is why it's actually such a big deal that David defeats him. Because if you can think of this very metropolitan culture, and they brought their giant who is well armed, well like sorted out, very capable, and there it's just like this country boy that comes and just throws a rock and kills him. So anyways, the last thing that I needed to look up, because I needed a little bit more of a reference of like, where did the term Canaanite come from? Because that's the one that I really think keeps popping up and up. It seems to be a term that, in one estimation, is that the term comes from to be low, to be humble, or to be subjugated is kind of some of the root of the word, where they think it's because it's the lowlands, but they're they're like an unorganized group of tribal people. So anytime Canaanites come up, just know there's no central Canaanite ruler. It's kind of a catch-all term of the people there, just the people that are in like these little people groups. They're not unified. They're just kind of there, and they're easily subjugated is kind of the implication.
But when they talk about the land of Canaan, is that a defined area that you can?
Yes and no. It's kind of like saying Midwestern and Midwesterners. Like, we say we're Midwesterners, but like we kind of have a fuzzy idea of the exact boundary of where the Midwest is.
Okay.
And it's kind of just like a grouping of people with like a similar-ish culture. Like, you can probably guarantee that a Midwesterner knows how to do a tailgate party, or like a Midwesterner knows how to make potato salad. That I think is like that's actually an accurate thing. So there's kind of this common culture with fuzzy edges that has some specificity when you go to like Midwestern Michiganders are different than Midwestern Ohio people, but they kind of have that similarity in that catch-all term, if that makes sense.
So where would you put Canaan on your map?
This area here.
Okay.
So that Egypt had cultural influence because they were the mega power at the time. So they were the big trading partner, is why that gets colored that way.
Okay. Who's the green group on your map?
I would have to look it up.
Okay.
They get taken over really quickly, though.
Okay.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of stuff about, maybe it's more in relation to Moses, about Canaan having false gods and defining a lot of the Jewish laws in that context of we are not like them. So they had some kind of commonality in their religion.
Once again, going back to the Midwest, I'm seeing we're at time, so I don't want to hold on too much longer. I think an accurate way to look at this is if you think about Midwesterners, and kind of saying U of M is the correct and only correct football team. It is the first among football teams. You shall have no other football team in front of U of M. U of M is the best of all. It is the only football team, and all other football teams are false football teams. But like each people group kind of had one. Okay. So there's a bunch of local gods basically, and this local god is saying we're the only local god, or we are the only, not just this people's local god. We like Yahweh is the only God, and that is an innovation actually. So anyways, knowing we're short on time, I do want to pray us out just to be respectful and send you all out for hopefully a really good Tuesday. So let us pray. Gracious God, I want to thank you for this group and always for all of their questions and their inquisitiveness and all of the ways that they bring out what you have in the text and look around to see how you're at work in the world. So I'm just so grateful for all that they bring to this study, God. I thank you that you're not just a God of one people group, you're not just the Midwestern God, but you really are the God of all people. And it's no matter where we are from or where we will take our final rest, but your promise to us says that we will rest in you together with all the people of all the world of all the times and places. Lord, you welcome us all back to you. And so we are grateful that we have that assurance of home, no matter what else happens in our life, that our home is truly in you, our creator, and the one who calls us all beloved. So we thank you for that assurance in our life and in our death. So we pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you as always.
Alrighty. See you next week.